I am Christopher Smith, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to Special Edition Episode 39 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is February 9th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today's episode is going to be broken up into a couple of parts. We're going to start off with a discussion with Christopher C. Smith. Now, I know you guys will say, well, you just had him on like 2 episodes ago. What do you have him on for again? Well, Chris actually took issue with the title of the episode that he was featured on, Bloody Brigham's Genocide. He figured genocide was an incorrect word. So I decided to read through a fair amount of his doctoral thesis, because he calls it Mormon Conquest, and, extract certain parts and discuss those parts with him. So that's what you're going to hear first. And of course, this conversation all stemmed from a Facebook comment thread wherein Chris and I were going back and forth on the definition of genocide. So I tried to come to the conversation with an open mind about whether or not to classify it as a genocide or just a conquest with many smaller skirmishes that comprise the bigger conflict. So I try not to go too hard of a line with this, because I'm just wanting more than anything to be educated on this, because if I have a fallacious perspective of what happened between Utah Mormons and Utah natives when they moved in, I want to understand that as much as possible. I don't want to harbor any misconceptions or misidentifications of what actually happened in the various battles that they had. So without further ado, this is my discussion. Well, I guess you can call it a teaching session with historian Christopher C. Smith. Today we are joined once again by a very special guest. Now, typically we don't have somebody come on essentially 2 weeks in a row, or just, 1 week spanning them. But Chris and I tended to have a little bit of a disagreement when it comes to some of the terminology regarding Brigham Young and the Mormon conquest / genocide that happened in Utah. So I'm inviting Chris on here to convince me that this was not a genocide. Brigham Young's actions carried out against the natives in Utah, in the Utah Territory and outerlying areas. But the reason why we're doing this as a separate episode is just to kind of hash out the details of what we consider a genocide and what is just, falls under the umbrella of a Mormon conquest for resources. So I'm hoping to gain some enlightenment on this, because I personally believe that genocide is the best way to describe it, but Chris has a different opinion. So let's get into it. Chris, thank you for coming back onto the show.
Yeah, thank you, Bryce.
Absolutely. And I should give you a proper introduction. This is Professor Christopher C. Smith of University of Utah tenured professorship, which
it's actually Utah State University, and it's a postdoctoral fellow. I'm not a tenured professor.
Okay, all right.
I would love to be, but
that's a very yes, 2 very sharp distinctions we need to draw. So thank you for clarifying that. But yeah, I mean, congratulations on your new move and the new apartment and everything. I hope everything's going well for you there.
Thank you. Yeah, it has been going really well. The reaction of the students has been very positive. I am not sleeping enough, but it's been good.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear it. And what better way to be, welcomed into the world of Mormon historianship than to have students that are listening to what you say. And I'm actually hoping to become one of those students today. Chris, you sent over your doctoral dissertation to me. And it's titled Mormon Conquest.
Right.
I have briefly, over the past couple days, just been trying to skim this and, gather as much information out of it as I possibly can. Of course, I haven't had time to read through all, nearly 400 pages of it before having this conversation with you, but I'm hoping that you can enlighten me as to some of the quotes that I extracted out of it. Many of them are quotes from your own personal words. But I do have to say, this kind of spawned, the genesis of this conversation that we're having today spawned from a comment thread that you and I were discussing on Facebook. I believe that you petitioned for me to change the title of the episode, and I didn't want to change it because I think that genocide is a great way to describe this, but you take issue with the word genocide. So maybe that's where we should start our discussion, and essentially it's where your dissertation started. How does a person define genocide and racism?
Sure. So the United Nations actually has a document on this. It's called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And that document defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And it includes not only mass murder, but also things like sterilizing all of a group's members or stealing their children so that they can't reproduce in subsequent generations.
I guess I'm curious, whereas, a lot of times when, two nations or two groups of people are warring against each other, eventually one is going to gain the upper hand. At what point do you consider what they're doing to be genocide as opposed to just warring groups of people? I guess that's a really fine line. I'm not seeing the difference in definition there.
Yeah, so there's sort of two categories, and genocide is close to what we call total war, but it's not identical to what we call total war. So total war is the idea that when you fight an implacable opponent, you have to use sort of extreme measures, including the killing of civilians. So, for instance, World War II became kind of a total war. We bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima, killing lots of civilians there. We firebombed Dresden. So those are examples of what we would call total war, where you're killing civilians along with combatants, often maybe even not taking surrender. And so it's extreme violence, but it doesn't qualify as genocide. And here's why it doesn't qualify as genocide. Because the objective in total war is not to completely exterminate the group that you're fighting against. The objective in total war is to completely break their resistance, to completely break their will to fight. So, for instance, after we bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Japanese surrendered and the war ended, and we didn't then, pursue a policy of systematic extermination of the remaining Japanese people. And the same in Germany. We sort of accepted their surrender and then, subjugated them to some extent, but we did not, go and exterminate the Germans. A genocide is different in that the actual objective is to eliminate the entire group. So the Holocaust was a genocide because the Germans were trying to essentially exterminate the Jewish people. And they used systematic propaganda to generate hatred and disgust toward the Jewish people, and to make people see them as vermin that needed to be exterminated. They used language about exterminating the rats, exterminating the vermin. And they developed a whole assembly line of killing, So they had, the gas chambers, and they had the concentration camps, and they had so many people involved in that process. And it was like an assembly line. And every person in that assembly line had one little job to do. And so they could they had a certain amount of deniability because there were all these other people in the chain and they were just following orders. And this is the sort of thing that you see time and time again in genocides. Genocides often are directed toward groups that are sort of within the polity, within the society, rather than outside the society. And you get these systematic propaganda campaigns to smear them and dehumanize them, and then you get these assembly lines of killing. Sometimes you get mass violence where there's a huge uprising, and basically, in the space of a few days, the entire nation is sort of up in arms, and often people killing friends and relatives in mass violence has happened in Rwanda. So it's basically, what happened in Utah does not rise to the level of that sort of phenomenon. When you study a few genocides, then you're going to be more hesitant to use that term, I think, because you realize like genocides are like a different category of thing. They are so horrible that I think to casually compare something like what happened in Utah to a genocide sort of cheapens genocide.
So let me take a couple of quotes from your, I think this is in the introduction of your piece here, and I think this kind of enlightens us a little bit. The genocides that you're talking about just now obviously are these paramount examples of what we consider to be genocide. But sure. You say this specifically, quote, "Conquest, however, cannot be reduced to military violence." I have to point this out. You said conquest, not genocide there. That's important. Mormons also dominated native peoples through political alliances, economic development, and religious proselytism, end quote. Now, from what I understand, and this is coming from a stance of near complete ignorance on this time because I haven't studied it personally. You know, I'm studying church history chronologically. I'm only up to 1839 in my own studies. So what we're talking about right here is completely foreign to me, and I'm basing a lot of my understanding of this off of your work and off of just a couple of articles that I found here. But at what point can we say when a group is conquesting against another group, taking their land, battling with them, killing many of them, forming political alliances that were only later to be dissolved and shredded when Wakara turned against the Mormons, and essentially forcing the natives to be a subhuman class of species? They were starving. They were completely starved. The natives were starved. There was a resource vacuum once the Mormons first moved out here. And Mormons were also trying to proselyte to them. I see all of this as an effort to de-nativize the Native Americans, to change them into white and delightsome people. Now, I let me see here. You say later in that same introduction, you say, quote, "Occasionally in this study, I use forms of the term genocide to describe Mormon policies and rhetoric. The United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such." And I think you just now said that. It almost seems like the cleansing that that the Mormons did, the appropriating, the cultural appropriation that they committed against the natives, while it may not fall under what we consider the Holocaust type of genocide or the Rwandan genocide, it does seem like they were, the Mormons were actively trying to strip away these people's culture from them. And the people that wouldn't conform, the people that would fight them, they would just kill them all off. I feel like that scrapes awfully close to the definition of genocide.
Right. So there's a few distinctions that we need to make here. Basically, one is that I should say this is like a really common dispute in Native American and Indigenous studies in general. So we're always fighting in this discipline about whether American treatment of natives qualified as genocide or not. And we're having similar kinds of conversations there, of course. And this distinction that I'm about to make is one of the major distinctions that happens in that discussion. So there's what we would call physical genocide, or just simply genocide. And that's where you're trying to physically destroy a collectivity. So social scientist Helen Fine defines genocide as sustained purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity, directly or indirectly.
Or indirectly, that's important. Indirect destruction as well. I think this falls under indirect destruction of the natives, very much so.
Well, so here's what she means by indirect. She means interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members, sustained regardless of the surrender or lack of threat offered by the victim. So she's talking about physical destruction. And, that could mean like stealing a group's children. It could mean preventing them from reproducing by sterilizing them. It could mean, killing them outright. But it's physical destruction. And then there's another class of genocide, which we call cultural genocide. And that's what you're talking about, right? Where you're trying to eliminate a group identity, or you're trying to eliminate an entire culture. And you might do that, for instance, the Indian placement program, where they basically took native children away from them and taught them in boarding schools, tried to teach them to be other than Indian, tried to teach them, white culture, American culture. That would be an example of what we might call cultural genocide, where you're sort of forcibly trying to expunge someone's culture from the face of the earth. And I'm not a huge fan of the concept of cultural genocide. People also talk about cultural violence. I think that these terms get used pretty loosely, and that if you aren't careful with them, then you can end up putting any kind of any time that you are trying to push your ideas or your views or your values, you could be accused of cultural genocide. Like, for instance, if we're trying to, change people's minds so that they're not, following ISIS or they're not going to, push radical fundamentalist forms of Islam, then we could be accused of cultural genocide because we're trying to eliminate that subculture of extreme violent Muslim faith.
Okay, let's continue on with that analogy and look at it from the religious extremist perspective, because so much of what was done in Utah was committed under the guise of religious extremism. For God and liberty, it was done at the hands of the Council of 50, from word down from Brigham Young. This is another quote from later on in your introduction. It says, "Thus, Arrington's Brigham Young, American Moses, reflecting a more mature perspective than his earlier work, lionizes Brigham Young, but acknowledges that Young initially refused to pay natives for land and briefly pursued a policy of extermination during the years of colonialization." Now, I know, of course, your dissertation only covers from 1848, essentially, or 1847 up to 1851, is it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So there's a fair amount of conflict there that isn't included, including what people, hang their hats on as the ultimate Utah massacre, like the Mountain Meadows massacre or something. But, that's not included in this time frame either. But when we say a policy of extermination, I guess, what does that mean? In your mind, what does it mean to have a policy of extermination? And at what point does it change from, at what point does a hypothetical religious leader, an ISIS leader, change from just an exterminationist to a genocidal maniac?
Right. So, basically, Brigham Young was opposed to collective punishment of natives, and he continually urged the settlers to, pursue a defensive strategy and build forts and so forth. But then at one point, the leaders of the Utah Valley settlement come to Brigham Young and they say, "We've all taken a vote. All of the male settlers of the settlement have taken a vote, and we voted to kill off the Indians." And so they basically asked Brigham Young permission to kill off the Indians. And he says, I guess if everybody is in agreement, then we've got to kill off the Indians. So he agrees to do this. And so they then go and declare war on the natives. And by the way, there had been a lot of escalation before this, so it's not like this came out of the blue. It was basically there had been some conflicts. There were some Mormon settlers who murdered a native man. And then the natives had killed a number of Mormon animals and fired over the heads of Mormon settlers as they were walking around the settlement. So this had been escalating for a long time, and the natives had basically built large fortifications near Fort Utah and were gearing up for a conflict and were sort of goading the settlers to some extent into a conflict. So I think that this differs from a genocide in the sense that there were two sides to this conflict, and both sides were sort of gearing up for war. So it really, to me, it falls under the category of a war rather than what we would consider a genocide. But once Brigham Young commits to this conflict, he says things like, "Let none escape." Let no hostile Indians escape. And that qualifier hostile is really important. Because he does, some of the natives who are friendly to the Mormons come into the fort and they're protected in the fort. And then after the conflict is over, they appoint one of those friendly natives named Black Hawk, who later fights with the Mormons in the Black Hawk War. But they appoint him to be the leader of the Timpanogos tribe after the war is over. And so the fact that they shelter a few Indians suggests that the objective was not actually extermination of the Timpanogos. It was extermination of the hostile Indians. And that, I think, is an important distinction because it takes this out of the category of genocide and puts it into the category of war. But still, the exterminationist rhetoric that was being used about letting none escape and taking no prisoners, and Brigham Young actually tells them to poison off the prisoners that they do take, and they gun down a bunch of prisoners on Table Mountain. So, like, it was horrible. It was an atrocity. It was total war. They definitely used some exterminationist rhetoric, but I don't think that it rises quite to the level of genocide because they shelter those natives in Fort Utah. So it's a subtle distinction and probably not a really important distinction in moral terms, but as a social scientist, it's an important distinction because the way that genocide works is different from the way that total war works.
I understand. I guess that sounds... It doesn't seem like that's a genocidal thing if you're harboring some of your enemies in an area and then instilling them into a position of power, like this Black Hawk person. But... Okay, so I want to take another quote out of your work here, and it has to do with manifest destiny. Of course, Utah was the new Zion. It was Deseret, the new Jerusalem. The new theocratic kingdom, essentially, Brigham Young was building. And this is a quote that you have in here. Quote, "There was also, of course, the ideology of Anglo-American manifest destiny, which made territorial expansion a moral good in service of progress and providence. As argued earlier in this introduction and by historians Armand Mass and Jared Hickman, the Book of Mormon canonized a Mormon version of manifest destiny in service of the kingdom of God. Mormon pioneers acted on that scriptural vision when they settled on native lands." And I guess my question to you would be, when it comes to an extermination or a genocide or something to this effect, it's always perpetrated by a group that feels ideologically or racially or somehow superior to another group. And, like when it came to the Mormons, they were carrying out their self-determined fulfillment of attaining their promised land, this new Zion in Utah. And so they could civilize it their own way. It was their own promised land. But if let me see. Here's another quote from your work as well. It says, "If they are not your equals, you cannot raise them up to you." And that was a quote from somebody. And it says, "This was cultural imperialism." And maybe this gets back to our cultural genocide discussion, but this was cultural imperialism, psychological domination of colonized people in order to convince them to submit and collaborate in their own colonization. Cultural imperialism, writes historian Bernard C. Payer, seeks through traumatic education and spiritual brainwashing to erase natives' identities and turn them into lower-class duplicates of Europeans while expropriating their lands. So right. I guess maybe I'm confusing a cultural genocide here with actual physical extermination and physical genocide, because it sounds like exactly what the Mormons were doing. They move into Utah. They say, this is our promised land. Brigham Young, this is the right place. And they feel like it is their duty, their God-given duty, to appropriate the lands and remove these uncivilized savages from their land so that they can appropriate it for themselves and civilize it in the way that they see fit. My question, I guess, would be, once one group feels superior to another group this way, isn't some level of genocide, cultural or physical, kind of a logical conclusion when both of those groups are diametrically opposed to each other?
Yeah, possibly. So I think I really don't, as I said before, I really don't like the term culture genocide as much as the term cultural imperialism. I think that cultural imperialism is sort of less sensationalist. So there's something in, arguments. We refer to Godwin's law, which is like if you have a disagreement with someone, it's not going to be very long before somebody gets compared to Hitler.
Right.
And I feel like the term cultural genocide is sort of like that. you sort of are comparing people to Hitler and or people to, perpetrators of genocide like in Rwanda. But I feel like it's such a different category of thing that I don't know that the comparison is really that appropriate. But I do definitely think that like this is, severely problematic. It's immoral, and it's often bound up with forms of physical violence. It's often bound up with forms of physical exploitation. So I definitely do think that the term cultural imperialism is a very appropriate term for what happened here.
Well, let me go to let me kind of dig in a little bit and dig into a quote you have another quote from your work here that quotes Brigham Young. It says, "Meanwhile, discouraged of Ute theft of livestock and misled by Gentile mountain men who deliberately sowed distrust between Mormons and the natives," I think you're talking about Jim Bridger and others there, Young preached in May of 1849 that adult Indians could never be civilized and were fit only for slaughter. Okay, that is very genocidal, but I'm going to continue reading here. His faith in Indian conversion revived a month later when, for the first time, he met Wakara, who invited Mormons to come make a settlement somewhere in the territory he ruled and to mix and trade with his people. Though delighted by the invitation to plant the Mormon flag in a new patch of soil, Young reminded his followers that they were not to fraternize with Indians or to treat them as equals. Now, my question would be, this quote that you have of Brigham Young preaching in May of 1849 that adult Indians could never be civilized and were fit only for slaughter. I looked everywhere for that quote and I can't find it. The only place I can find that is a link back to a blog post on that. I can't find it where it's not in the Journal of Discourses because this is before the Journal of Discourses. I can't find the letter exchange or anywhere where that quote came from. But once somebody says something like this, that the Indians can never be civilized and were fit only for the slaughter, that just, that just rings true of genocide. And maybe this is what you were talking about earlier in your introduction, is this, some of the things said by Mormons, sound genocidal. And I guess once you preach something like this from the pulpit, is there any way that Brigham Young could go back? Once he had this perspective of the Indians, is there any way that he could change that perspective or, ever gain an alternate perspective? Because I see it like they're already otherized. They're already a subgroup of people. And Young says explicitly, you cannot fraternize with them. You cannot treat them as equals, and says they're only fit for slaughter. That sounds like a turning point. Like there's no going back after that.
Well, they definitely otherized them. They definitely subjugated them. Young definitely saw them as inferiors. I am quite clear in my dissertation that they were racist. The Mormons were racist. When he talks about adult Indians being fit only for slaughter, he's not actually saying we should slaughter them. He's saying we should let them kill each other. We should let the Americans kill them. If they get killed, that'll be fine. That's no big deal because that's all they're good for. So it's not quite as bad as it sounds. I probably should have paraphrased that a little bit better because it makes it sound like he's, saying, let's go kill the Indians. And that's not actually what he was saying in that quote. He was just saying they can never be converted. So they're really only, that they need to die off basically so that we can convert their children.
Yeah. And engage the cultural imperialization, as you call it.
Right. Exactly. And I think we all have moments, right, where we despair of our opponents, in an argument or something like that. We're this person will never change their mind. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna have that view of that person forever. Maybe down the road you see something in that person that suggests that maybe that person will listen to you, or maybe you can work with that person after all. And so we're always changing our mind about people, right? We always have these ups and downs in our relationships with people. So I think that was an absolute low in Young's view of the Indians, in his relationship with the Indians. But I don't think that that's an irreversible turning point. I think he does reverse himself quite quickly, actually.
I guess it's hard to understand the mindset of somebody from, more than 150 years ago, right? Trying to put ourselves into their mind. we're trying to do this through like first and second hand journal entries and what, Dimmick Huntington and Oliver Huntington and other historians chronicled when they arrived here. So there's no way to truly understand what Brigham Young's motivations were, I don't think. But I wanted to ask about something, and this is, I think, tangentially related, because it falls under what we consider, war crimes today. And this is another quote from your work here. It says, cartographer Charles Pruis had written in 1843, almost all the natives are now obliged to live on roots. Game can scarce be seen anymore. That's, of course, because of the resource vacuum that the Mormons created. The Mormons' arrival in 1847 would amplify these problems. At least 10 epidemics would sweep through native populations from 1847 to 56, reducing some bands' number by more than 2/3. Natives lacked the immunities Europeans had developed over millennia of exposure to these contagions. In 1852, Sauret would nostalgically remember when the sandpits in Timpanogos had been great and numerous. Hundreds had once lived in the Wasatch Mountains, but their territory had contracted with their population, and Sauret would find none there now. End quote. Now, I have to ask, the vast majority of the contagions that swept through native populations were just those smallpox or measles or, any number of old world diseases that they obviously just didn't have the immune systems to combat. But I also know that we gave Native Americans blankets with diseases to deliberately infect them, biochemical warfare, war crimes today. I guess my question would be, given the level of natives dying off from 47 to 56, as soon as the Mormons arrive, some groups were reduced by 2/3. That's just a lot of people. I mean, that's thousands of people, probably tens of thousands of people dead by an invisible enemy. I mean, were the Mormons at any point, were they committing, chemical warfare against, biological warfare against the natives? Were they giving any blankets to the natives? Is there any evidence for something like that?
There's no evidence for biological warfare by the Mormons. They do, when they go and fight the Goshutes, they consider putting poison in the Goshute well. They never actually do that, but it's I think, seriously discussed. Another historian has suggested that it was said jokingly, that it was said in jest, but I think it was, a serious discussion. But they didn't actually do that, and so the answer really is no.
Because, that's a straight act of trying to destroy an entire class of people is by biological warfare. That's one of the quintessential examples of genocide, or one of the quintessential pieces in the genocidal toolbox. So it's just an interesting thought to entertain. I guess what evidence would we expect to find of something like that other than somebody talking about it in jest? So I don't know. Interesting to maybe speculate upon. And then I wanted to ask about Brigham Young's his reaction to deserters and apostates, because I think this is probably really important. If you read the letter, the time capsule letter that was reopened from the Utah State time capsule in 1979, it was this Aaron DeWitt letter, I believe it was. And he essentially just paints Bloody Brigham as this horrible, just evil, disgusting, black-hearted, bloody priesthood, I think is what he called him. And I know that there are stories of Brigham Young treating apostates and deserters as an other group, and, maybe causing them to be disappeared in the night by the Danites. But this is a quote that you included here, talking about a group of deserters. Quote, "Some who traveled to neighboring valleys went without authorization. In early October, a few Mormon deserters absconded with their wagons and families to Gentile mountain man Miles Goodyear's trading post at the confluence of Weber and Ogden rivers. Goodyear's post was the only white Gentile settlement in the Wasatch Front and Range. Immediately upon hearing of their departure, the Salt Lake High Council sent City Marshal John Van Cott with a letter demanding the deserters' return. The deserters turned back, but the council noted that their minds are somewhat embittered, and we shall do all we can to save them. In November, the council authorized Henry G. Sherwood and Mormon Battalion Captain James Brown to buy out Goodyear's property to prevent it from becoming a haven for apostates. End quote. So I guess my question would be, how much of the rhetoric that we hear from like Aaron DeWitt and other people claiming that Brigham Young would just kill any deserters, how much of that is actually, just hyperbole? How much is true?
Well, that's hard to tell.
Yeah.
I think that I don't think that they killed deserters. Brigham certainly made a lot of threats to that effect, but Brigham also talked about being a coward and, kind of not being willing to follow through on his threats because he was sort of afraid of the consequences.
That doesn't sound like the Brigham Young that I know whatsoever.
Oh, you should look up Brigham Young. Like, go to Google and type in Brigham Young coward. You will find all kinds of quotes where Brigham Young talks about being a coward. He talked about this a lot, actually.
Interesting. That sounds calculated almost.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I think the threats were calculated. I don't think he necessarily meant to follow through on all his threats, but I do think that he often hoped that his followers would follow through on his threats. He generally doesn't give explicit orders because he kind of wants that deniability, but he kind of like invites people to kill the people who he has singled out.
Yeah, just make them an offer they can't refuse. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
man?
exactly.
Yeah, I
exactly.
Get
you. It's the mob boss style of leadership, and so. Yeah, so I think actually that does not happen very often. Like, people don't take him up on those offers very often, but there are a few people, including, Porter Rockwell and Bill Hickman, who are willing to do that for Brigham Young. And so, depending on whether those people are in the room at the time when he when he issues one of these orders on somebody, it happens in some cases and not in others. And he also, when somebody gets killed, he is quite willing to sort of let the killer off the hook,
Yeah, which I mean that sounds even more calculated on his part. Like, oh, you killed. Oh, well, we'll just take care of that. Slap on the wrists. I don't know. That's just it all sounds so calculated.
Right. I have a story in my dissertation here about a Missourian doctor named J.M. Vaughn. I don't know if you read that part, but basically he was a Gentile doctor who lived in St. Pete during the winter of 1850 to 1851. And he was, there was this guy named Madison Hamilton who had gone away to work, and Vaughn was sort of like meeting up with Hamilton's wife a lot, and they would play together, and they were seen, like going into the back room and blowing out the candle for a while, and and doing all of this like very boldly. And he was warned that he could get in trouble with this, but he said, no, it's no big deal. And then, so when Madison Hamilton returns from the north, he shoots Vaughn. And he's tried for this in Salt Lake City, and Brigham Young speaks at the trial and basically, like, exonerates him, clears him of the crime. And Brigham Young says, I'm not speaking as the prophet of the Lord, but only as Brigham Young. But of course, like, the court still takes his word as gospel. And without even like opening the court officially, they motion and second that Mr. Hamilton be acquitted, and it was unanimously carried by the court that he be acquitted. And the court cheers, and people say to him, "God bless you, Mr. Hamilton," and so like, yeah, it was like almost this celebration of him having killed this Gentile adulterer. So that's the sort of thing that happened in Utah. There were definitely deaths. There were definitely people who were murdered. And Brigham Young, was definitely part of that.
Well, so I want to, let's talk a little bit about this Aaron DeWitt letter. Are you familiar at all with it, this time capsule letter?
I'm not familiar with that letter, no.
Okay. So it was kind of hard to track this down. When I first heard of it, I quoted it briefly on an episode, but then in looking for it a second time, it was much harder to find the second time. So I decided to recreate it, or to reprint it on the show notes for this episode. And the episode was 27 Broadsword, Javelin, Bowie Knife, and a Bucket of Crazy, which is the episode in which we introduced Brigham Young. This is what Aaron DeWitt says. Of course, he was lured out. Let's see. So he said he wrote this to his sister January 31st, 1875. So 1875, a lot has happened with Brigham Young at this point. This is, I guess it would be right before his death. He starts it out with, "How to commence this letter I have promised you so long I hardly know, but will say in the first place I have been deceived, led into error, imposed upon, deluded, beguiled into a false religion in my youth, and spent the best part of my life in a wilderness, a desert, a land of sage and salt, away from all enlightenment and civilization, among the most degraded tribes of Indians on the Western Hemisphere." And that's just the opening sentence to this. But he goes on to talk about, on the 12th day of September, 1857, 119 men, women, and children were murdered while traveling to California. Of course, we're all familiar with that, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And then another similar case is that of the murder of the Morosites, a religious body of simple-minded who had met together for devotional exercise in a small valley on the banks of the Weber River in the summer of 1862, when a corps of the Nauvoo Legion, led by cowardly Captain Burton, who is now on a mission preaching the gospel. He is the dastardly dog who crawled on his belly like his ancient progenitor, which tempted Mother Eve until it was near enough to a fire cannon to blow down the house where those poor souls had met. So there's the Morosite massacre in 1862. And then he talks about a Dr. Robinson, who they lured out of his house in the middle of the night. And the doctor had just retired to bed, but at his murderer's entreaties, he dressed himself and in a few moments was on his errand of mercy to go set this man's arm. He had not gone far when one of the villains who walked behind struck him on the head with a meat chopper he had stolen for the purpose and cleft open his skull. And that was just in the middle of the street in the middle of the night. He goes on to say, "I would also mention the dead man in the meat market, the 3 men in the barn, the murder near the Warm Springs, the shooting of Pike in the streets of Salt Lake City in broad daylight, the murder of the Potters and parishes of Rhodes and Roberts, and hundreds of others who have been murdered in cold blood and robbed to satisfy the avaricious cravings of as foul a man and as false a prophet as have ever disgraced this sin-stained earth." And then he goes on to discuss much more about Brigham Young. Those are just some small excerpts, but this sounds like Brigham Young is embodying this idea of a mob boss, or not. I mean, he's gone beyond that. He just sounds like a theocratic king, and he's just doing whatever he wants in Utah. I mean, this is kind of the Brigham Young that I've constructed in my brain, who is dealing with the Indian uprising. I mean, I guess, how would you respond to any of what I just said?
Yeah, well, I think that the anti-Mormons do exaggerate some of those murders, but like some of them are totally legit. Like the Parrish Potter murders, it's been pretty conclusively shown that really happened, and that the Mormons were responsible for that. So there were definitely murders that happened. And I think that Brigham Young kind of learns this from Joseph Smith, because Joseph Smith is doing much the same thing. And he sort of, brings Brigham Young along. But I don't think that Brigham Young, I don't think that he is, he is as enthusiastic about all of this as Joseph Smith was. I think that he always has some reservations. He has kind of a line that he won't cross, and that a lot of it is empty rhetoric. A lot of it is not actually being carried out. So I don't think that Brigham Young is really doing that like on a regular basis. But remember, he lives for a very long time, so you can definitely find a half dozen examples of this over his career. So, well,
I guess my question, somebody who's willing to command people to be killed for the sake of the preservation of the theocracy. I mean, I can't imagine that he was excited about it. Oh, yay, I get to kill people today. I mean, I don't think many people throughout any history have said that. But, I mean, at what lengths do you think Brigham Young would go in order to solidify this theocracy? I mean, it just seems like the type of person who was willing to command people to be murdered at the hands of his cronies. He'd be willing to go to any lengths, even if that meant genocide. And maybe that's the point that I'm having the toughest time with, is when it comes to genocide or intent for or extermination, you have to evaluate intent. Is it the person's intent to eradicate these people completely? And when somebody was branded as an apostate, or as, like the Mountain Meadows massacre, if you were part of the Baker Fancher party, you were branded as the prophet killer group, the people who had shot Parley Pratt in the field. Once somebody was successfully otherized, it seems like Brigham Young didn't necessarily, maybe he held reservations about commanding these people to be eradicated or exterminated, but it seems like they were still done, though. I mean, in the best interest of the theocracy.
Yeah. I think that Brigham Young is a very pragmatic person, but he's also a very paranoid person, and he has definitely a superiority complex, and he's really against sexual sin. So, like in the case of Vaughn, like he's quite happy to have Vaughn killed because he was an adulterer. So whenever he sees somebody as a threat to the kingdom, he's going to be more willing to have that person killed. But I don't think that he ever saw natives as a threat to the kingdom on that scale, to the point where he would, order the extermination of all of the natives. He sort of ordered the extermination of like select groups of natives who seemed to be hostile and seemed to be interfering with Mormon settlement. He did do that. I think he definitely saw the natives as a resource that could be exploited through like political domination. I think that he genuinely believed in the prophecies of the Book of Mormon that the natives were going to become white and delightsome and were going to be Christianized and everything. So he had some reasons to keep, some natives around. The natives who he felt he could work with, he had some motivation to keep them around. But the ones who were obviously hostile and getting in the way, he was, willing to have killed off. So, but as I said before, he advised primarily a defensive strategy. So he wanted to prevent that from ever becoming an issue. He wanted to prevent the natives from ever having the opportunity to become such an obstacle to Mormon settlement that they would have to be killed off. And this is where he's distinct from a number of his subordinates who were in favor of collective punishment from the very beginning. So I actually give Brigham Young some credit for that.
I guess in your own mind, did that stem from his paranoia of being checked by somebody, of somebody coming in, United States government officials coming in and saying what happened to all these natives, or what drove his reservations when other people, including Stansbury. Here's a quote of an interaction that you had between Colonel Stansbury and Brigham Young in response to the Ute violence. It said, quote, "The Utes had annoyed the government surveyors in Utah Valley by hanging around the camp, crowding around the cook fires, more like hungry dogs than human beings, eagerly watching for the least scrap that might be thrown away, which they devoured with avidity and without the least preparation." Now, I have to add personally, that's because the Mormons moving in created a resource vacuum. Everybody was that hungry.
Yeah.
You continue on here. Utes had stolen some government cattle. Stansbury also knew the leader of the Indians, and that's referring to Pariuts, I think, to be a crafty and bloodthirsty savage who had been already guilty of several murders and had openly threatened that he would kill every white man that he found alone upon the prairies. That sounds like genocide of white people there. Stansbury regarded the expedition as a matter of absolute necessity and self-preservation, and even chided Young a little for having been so slow to resort to violence, end quote. So, even when other people were advocating for, actual systematic type genocide, where do you think these reservations came from with Brigham Young? Like, what motivated him to be reserved in these instances when other people were saying, dude, just kill them all, giving him complete license to do whatever he wanted?
Right. Well, I think Brigham Young actually did have some sense of justice, and I think that he genuinely believed in the prophecies of the Book of Mormon about the Lamanites sort of becoming white and Galilean people and helping the saints to build the city of refuge and to fight the U.S. government, which he thought was sort of imminent. So he saw them playing an apocalyptic role, and he saw them as being kind of evidence for the gospel, and so he wanted them to fulfill those roles, those prophesied roles. And so I don't have as negative a view of Brigham Young as you do and as a lot of people do, because I think that he was a genuine believer, whereas I actually wouldn't say the same about Joseph Smith. So
you don't think that know. Wait, hang on, say what you wouldn't say that Joseph Smith was a believer? Wait, what?
No, I don't actually think Joseph Smith was sincere. I think he was a con man, and I think he knew exactly what he was doing. But I wouldn't say that about Brigham Young. So.
Wow. There's actually a lot to parse out right there. That's that's probably a whole discussion in and of itself. But I did want to I want to talk more on Brigham Young here, because from our discussion so far and from the reading that I've done of your material, I'm having a hard time applying the word genocide to anything, because genocide, kind of as you have argued from the beginning here, it's a very narrow definition. Only very few actual instances throughout history fall under the word genocide. Extermination, that's one thing, but to actually carry out genocide is something completely different. But I want to quote something that you talk about during the February 1850 battle against the Utes, because this was around, I think, Utah Lake, where it was a hotly contested area that the Utes had been settled for a long time. And this is a quote here. Not yet satisfied, the militia determined to finish what it had started. About 6 a.m. on February 11th, Major General Daniel H. Wells arrived at Fort Utah to personally oversee operations. Now, this is quoting Daniel H. Wells, quote, I was ordered by Brigham Young not to leave the valley until every Indian was out, end quote. So, that sounds like explicit commands to destroy all of the Utes, essentially, till every Indian was out, to exterminate them, whether that means by removal or battle, because they killed a lot of them here.
Right.
Does that not, to not leave until every Indian was gone, does that not sound, through a very limited scope, like it's genociding the Ute Indians around Utah Lake that way?
This is why I say that some of the Mormon rhetoric and some of the Mormon policies struck a genocidal note, is because they say things like that. But notice that he says until every Indian is out, not until every Indian is dead, which is a significant distinction, right? Because the definition of genocide is to destroy a collectivity, not to expel a collectivity. So that still is not... It does not quite rise to the level of genocidal rhetoric, but it's very close. But then they shelter some natives. This is the conflict where they shelter some natives in Fort Utah. So I think that we have to be a little bit careful about taking some of these statements that sound extreme too literally. I have heard people who are friends and family members make comments that sound genocidal about like Muslims or about other groups. But I think that, at the end of the day, if it came down to a fight, I don't know that they would actually practice genocide. We say these things, and then, like, when the rubber meets the road, we don't act on them. We don't act completely consistently with, like, the most extreme things that we've ever said, right?
Well, so I want to push back on that a little bit.
Sure.
Because here's another account from Flew the Coop. This is on MormonCurtain.com. Of course, I haven't verified the historicity of this, but I'm sure you've heard of it because you've been studying this yourself. And this is from Rex Fulmer's account from James Munson's journal. It says... Towards evening, some of the captives succeeded in getting loose and commenced an attack upon the guards, knocking 2 of them down. This is talking about the Paiute Indians. The guard was afraid of a general break, hence the guard opened fire and shot 2 of the Indians. After a short consultation, it was decided that the settlement would be in danger if the Indians were allowed to escape. Though the people loathed the thought of killing them, it was nevertheless concluded to do so. And then it goes on to say, although no account tells who gave or carried out the instructions, no decision of this sort would have been without the knowledge and consent of those in charge, namely Captain James Allred and Bishop William Allred. I'm sure those names ring a bell for you. Fulmer estimated that about a dozen Paiute men remained in the meeting house. One by one, the guards began taking them outside, leading them around to the side of the building, where one person clubbed them in the back of the head, stunning them, then another cut their throats with a large, sharp knife. Once the Paiute men were dispatched, the settlers began taking the women and older children from the cellar, killing them by the same method. Fulmer wrote that, quote, a number of children were spared alive, and also an older boy who, however, was killed the next day as he was considered dangerous to the peace of the settlement. After the carnage, the settlers placed all the bodies in a cellar and filled it with dirt. Nothing today remains to mark the common grave, end quote. That is, I mean, these people had surrendered. The Mormons had them gathered together as prisoners of war in a fort, and then they just took them out one by one and killed every one of them except for the children. And I assume that the children were once, after this happened, appropriated into the Mormon families to turn their skin white and delightsome. So, I mean, that's horrible. That is, I mean, that's a massacre right there.
I agree. And I would say that's a genocidal moment in Mormon history. And so that's, this is an example of why I say that there was not a systematic policy of genocide, but there were policies and rhetoric that struck a genocidal note. So I think this is kind of like a genocidal moment in Mormon history. I don't think that it's part of a systematic policy that came down from Brigham Young. So that's the distinction that I would make.
I mean, how many isolated massacres like this do we have to have against how many different people before we call it just a genocide?
Yeah. I mean, if it was connected to some kind of systematic policy, then I would call it a genocide. But, massacres have happened throughout history. And I just don't think that this qualifies. But I can definitely understand why people disagree with me on that too, so.
I guess it's not really much of a semantical argument, but I guess it kind of drops down more to the definition of a genocide, because I see a genocide as it can be an amalgamation of small massacres, bundled together, and then you can say that this was the Mormon genocide from, 1847 to 58 or whatever, when the majority of these massacres kind of, ceased or stopped being such a frequent occurrence. But, I understand that it doesn't fit the definition of genocide because it wasn't perpetrated against just one small group of people. It was perpetrated by the Mormons against pretty much anybody who opposed them, whoever they were, whether they were, the Baker Fancher Party or they were Native Americans. It didn't seem to matter as long as they were the enemy. So I don't know. I guess I'm still torn on whether or not I personally want to consider this genocide or not, or just, small isolated acts of massacre. I don't know. This is kind of a tough semantical or a tough definitional debate that I'm having with myself at the moment almost.
Yeah, well, you are in good company because, as I said, the entire discipline of sort of Native American history is having the same conversation about natives in general, because there were so many massacres, there were so many sort of isolated conflicts that develop into total war kinds of situations where people are killing civilians indiscriminately. There was, so many sort of exterminationist comments made by individual people all over the place, but it was not, at least most of the time, it was not like a systematic policy coming down from the American government that we were going to commit genocide. It was more like a cultural something that was in the air where people were kind of making these comments, and some people were willing to actually act on those comments, not everyone. And so the question that we then have to ask is, does this rise to the level of genocide or not? If it was, like a lot of isolated incidents that were connected to sort of a broad cultural ethos, broad cultural prejudices, but not to a broad policy, political policy, does that qualify as genocide? And I think a number of very respectable scholars have said yes, it does, and a number have said it doesn't. And to a great extent, it boils down to how do you define genocide? Where do you draw the line?
Right, and does the genocide? I mean, in order to be classified as a genocide, does it have to be essentially perpetrated at the hands of one crazy madman? The way that we picture genocide happening, the Jewish Holocaust, that was perpetrated essentially from command from one single group of leaders from the Third Reich. But if we have a bunch of isolated acts of massacres happening that are not, organized or perpetrated from this mass organizational body, then are they really qualified as the collective fighting and the collective that we have of all these massacres together? Does that constitute genocide? I mean, well, let me ask your opinion then, and feel free to preface this with whatever verbiage you find necessary. But in your opinion, not just the Mormon conflict, but the broader colonialization of America, do you consider that to be genocide committed against the Native Americans?
I definitely consider it to be imperialism. I consider it to be cultural imperialism, because I think that those both definitely were the policy of the United States. I don't generally consider it to be genocide, and that's for a few reasons. One is that most of the killing was actually due to disease, and it was not intentional on the part of Americans. It was they had these values about farming and the way that you were supposed to exploit resources and stuff that had just devastating effects on native lifestyles. Yeah. That resource vacuum that you keep talking about. I don't think that Mormons intended to create that resource vacuum, but that was the natural effect of the way that they were living their lives. And so most of the native deaths actually result from those things, not from systematic killing. There are a lot of incidents of killing and massacring natives. There are even some that, come down from political leaders, but they're sort of individual incidents. There's never a systematic policy coming down from the American government where they're we're going to kill off all the Indians. And for me, a genocide describes something sustained. And I think that there are genocidal people in early America who are going out and perpetrating genocide or trying to perpetrate genocide on a limited scale. But I don't think that it was a national genocide. So maybe that's the distinction that I would make.
Can we distill down single events that happened as consider them genociding on a smaller scope? The thing that the paramount example that comes to my mind is Andrew Jackson signing the Indian Removal Act, which eventually led to the Cherokee Nation being chased out of Georgia and the Trail of Tears, and they were chased out. They weren't set up in firing lines and then shot, but they were removed from their homes with nothing. I mean, they weren't able to take anything with them, just the clothing on their back. And it was essentially, I guess it wasn't sanctioned policy for them to do this, but they just, most of them just died off before they even completed the Trail of Tears.
Right. It's a death march. They marched them to Oklahoma, and I think... I don't recall the numbers, but it was a huge number of people who died en route during this death march.
Yes, but so that was maybe not explicitly we are doing this in order to kill them off, but I mean, it was signed in as an Indian Removal Act to appropriate the land for the Union. But can that, just by the product of what came out of it, could that be considered a genocide at some extent?
Yeah, I mean, this is hard because that definition of genocide makes reference to intent. And so what was the intent? And it's the intent to physically destroy an entire collectivity, right? Not just to like kill or waste a lot of lives, but to actually destroy the entire collectivity.
And to take over their land. That's essentially what happened, right?
Well, yeah, taking over their land is more imperialism than genocide, but genocide is really about like eliminating the collectivity. And so I don't know if the Trail of Tears qualifies as genocide, but I do know it qualifies as like a horrific event, and like the disdain that was shown for Native lives there is like morally awful and rises to the level of probably, you know, one of the worst things that we as a nation have ever done. And so, I mean, if we're talking about like the social scientific category that we put this violence in, I would say probably not genocide. But if we're talking about like, is this, if we're asking, is this genocide to make a moral assessment, I would say regardless of whether we call it genocide or not, it was morally horrific, you know, and I don't think it really matters what we call it. It was evil. So...
Now, and you saying that, now it just sounds like you're ducking away from the word genocide, because it fits. I understand, like, you spend the first, you spend the majority of the introduction of your thesis in a discussion whether, you know, what is racism and what is genocide. And it's important to understand kind of the way that you come at the term of genocide and the way you approach the term racism, because I think they're fairly nuanced and well backed up in the literature from what you cite. And I find it to be interesting, but I also find it extremely restricting, in my opinion, because I find, you know, the Trail of Tears to be a great example of what we could call a 19th century genocide perpetrated against the Native Americans. Now, if it doesn't fill the criterion of intent, where, you know, the intent was to move them from point A to point B, and the fact that it became a genocide only in aggregate, in practice, once these people made the march and thousands of them died, you know, maybe that has a lot to do with the definition of genocide, is the intent, whether you intend to actually eradicate these people and their culture and their land and their everything, or their elimination is merely just a happy byproduct of you not wanting them to be in a place. But in my opinion, I think it fits perfectly in the definition of genocide.
Yeah. So morally, I am a consequentialist, which means that I believe that the morality of an action lies in the consequences of that action, not in the intent of that action. There is a philosophy called intentionalism, which lodges the morality of an action in the intention of it, right?
The same people that put forward intentionalism would claim that there's no such thing as a selfless act, which I disagree with. So...
I think the problem with intentionalism is basically that it lets people off the hook, you know? Like, if you are ignorant of the consequences of your actions, and you are willfully ignorant even to the point where, like, you just, like, you aren't even trying to make an assessment of the consequences of your action, if your action leads to, you know, thousands of people getting killed, as long as you didn't intend that, then you're off the hook. And so to some extent, I think that, like, as a moral category, I don't like the term genocide because it relies on this idea of intent, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, like, the Trail of Tears was morally horrific because the consequence was that thousands of people died, regardless of the intent. But intent has some significance, right? Because if you're trying to figure out whether somebody is trustworthy or not, it matters whether they understand the consequences of their actions, but it also matters what their intent is. So, you know, I think that when we're making judgments of historical people, we have to make a distinction between intentional things and unintentional things. But when we're making a moral assessment of, you know, was what they did wrong, it has to be the consequences that really matter ultimately. So I would not say that, like, everyone in early America was like a bad person, because of course they were, you know, raised in this racist environment, and, you know, very few people actually transcended that. So if we're making an assessment of like whether these were terrible, horrible people, I would generally say no, but did they commit horrific atrocities that were like horrifically evil? Yes, they did. And consequentially speaking, whether or not intent is involved, it's a consequential genocide. That's what I'm getting from you. A concession of the entire argument today. It's a consequential. Well, yeah. I mean, the term genocide uses intention in the definition, and I can't get away with that. So I don't use that term very often. But I do, you'll notice that I do use it a little bit in my dissertation. I say this struck a genocidal note, because I just can't, I don't want to let people completely off the hook, So, yeah, well, and when you have a church leader preaching from the pulpit that these people need to be, make sure that until every Indian is out, or what were some of the other, the other genocidal sounding Brigham Young quotes? Let none escape, yeah, let none escape. I mean, that just allows us a purview into the mechanism that was driving these actions to being committed. And that sounds, speaking for intentions, maybe it didn't play out in practice, but intentionally speaking, I think you say it very well. It strikes genocidal notes. It sounds genocidal, even if that isn't what ended up happening. So I don't know. I don't know how to kind of reconcile this. I do think that changing the name of the episode is probably within probably is necessary to do at this time, because given your nuanced definition of genocide, and given, I guess, the broader understanding that I've gained of genocide from reading your work here, I don't think that it necessarily fits in. Maybe the word that you used for it is perfect, Mormon conquest. And it just so happens when we look at these things and simplify and overgeneralize and say, that thousands of Native Americans died at the hands of Mormons, that sounds like genocide. But when we actually examine each individual battle that played out and, understand much more of the nuance, maybe just conquest, maybe that's the better word for all of this. Yeah, I think it was always complicated, and I really don't think that it compares to some of the sort of classic historical cases of genocide. So this is something that I had a lot of angst over, whether I was going to use this term or not, as I prepared my dissertation. And I ultimately decided, that this did not qualify as genocide. But yeah, I definitely don't want to let the Mormons off the hook. It was pretty horrible, some of the things that happened. So. Yeah, and maybe I have to qualify my own perspective of Brigham Young a fair amount. When I first started studying Mormon history, the first real Mormon history book that I ever read, or Mormon historical book, was Mormonism Unveiled, which is, historically speaking, the first anti-Mormon book out there. So a fair amount of my understanding of people like Brigham Young has come from reading what is considered anti-Mormon literature. Now, I think the labels of pro and anti-Mormon literature are far too simplistic, but they are useful for the conversation. So the Brigham Young that I understand is colored a significant amount by, like this Aaron DeWitt letter and other, characterizations that I've seen of him, comics and whatnot. And it seems, he fills out this visage of kind of like a Bond villain, this treacherous, disgusting person, as Aaron DeWitt says it, as full of meanness as old Satan and as thirsty for blood as a stinted leech. That's kind of the Brigham Young that I know, but I understand that that's ignoring a fair amount of nuance. And, the guy was, as you said, a pragmatic businessman. He did probably what was best for the Saints to continue Zion, to continue the settlement of Utah and the surrounding areas in New Mexico once it was liberated. And, he was, I don't know, it seems like he's a much more enriched character. Having read through a bit of your dissertation here, I seem to understand Bloody Brigham
quite a bit more, but I still think Bloody Brigham's a perfect name for him, because whether or not he intended to genocide people doesn't matter. A lot of the things that he did were fairly bloody and bloodthirsty, and very smart businessman. But that being said, I can't wait to read through the rest of your dissertation here. I've only essentially read just skimming through it and the introduction and conclusion of your chapters, and I've learned quite a lot. And it seems like this is a historical vacuum, a time where there isn't a whole lot of available historiography for it, and you kind of fill the vacuum with your dissertation here. And I look forward to seeing this information in book form soon. I really hope that you're planning on turning this into a full length feature print book, because the information here is absolutely necessary for people to understand.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I plan on it.
Okay, good. That being said, I kind of want to give you the last word here. What would you encourage anybody that has an ignorant perspective of Brigham Young and the Utah Native relations? Where should I go? What should I do? What should I consider? What should I think about here going into my further studies of Mormon history?
Oh, man. Well, I think that John Turner's book is a really great place to start, Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet. Have you read that one?
I have not.
Well, it's a fabulous book, and I think it illustrates, how Brigham Young goes from kind of just a normal person to being more of a tyrant, and whereas I think that Joseph Smith sort of starts out a bit bad, I actually don't think Brigham Young starts out that way. And so I would encourage you to read that book. I think it'll give you a more nuanced perspective on Brigham Young and how he ends up the way he does.
Absolutely. And if somebody, I'm recommending your dissertation, but I guess it's not available for open public consumption. I think it's probably only available on Academia EDU. But yeah, it seems like this is a great place to further deeper research for this window from 1847 to 51 or 52, because you do a great job of deconstructing and telling about the various scraps, the various conflicts that happened. And I like I said, I can't wait to read through the whole thing and get a better understanding of it. But of course, Chris, thank you much for coming on here and for discussing essentially the terminology of what happened in Utah. I tried to come to this with an open mind, an open perspective. I wasn't sure what to expect as I was reading through and what to expect out of this conversation, but more than anything, I was just hoping that you could teach me something today, and I feel like I have learned a lot from you, and for that, I am very gracious. Thank you very much for doing so.
Well, thank you for having me on, Bryce.
Absolutely, and as is the goal of all educators, we just want to get all the information out there as much as possible. So if anybody does want to find where Chris is located, I'll have links for his Facebook and other pages in the show notes for this episode, and we will hopefully have you on in the future once we get into the Utah years, so you can really discuss some of the details of your expertise here.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
It's time for Mormon Mimsies.
If I show you something, promise you won't tell?
Like a secret? Really? Cool.
All right, welcome everybody to our second installment of Mormon Mimsies. So last week I read this quote. In the course of the winter, I attended their meeting. I believe I was the first person with a young man, whose name I have forgotten, who was present when they took what they called the sacrament up at the Morley house. And then the quote ended with, and if I had my cloak, I would have stolen the wine and carried it home to see whether it was drugged or not. So that was the quote, and as is the nature of Mormon Mimsy and every evolving concept as we go, Well, we got in a response for it, and this was from Jared. He said, the Mormon Mimsy is the Braden and Kelly debate, page 884, J.J. Moss's testimony in a hearing about the reputation and moral character of the prominent men of the church in Kirtland. Ding, ding, ding. That is our winner. Well done, Jared. Now, he didn't go the typical routes of posting on Twitter with a hashtag of Mormon Mimsy, nor did he post it up on the Facebook page. He just went to patreon.com and commented there on the episode's thread. So, well done, Jared. He's the winner of this week's Mormon Mimsy. This is our Mormon Mimsy for this week. Quote, inhabitants of the moon are more of a uniform size than the inhabitants of the earth, being about 6 feet in height. They dress very much like the Quaker style, and are quite general in style, or one fashion of dress. They live to be very old, coming generally near 1,000 years. End quote. Alright, so I'm not asking where that quote came from. I am just asking for a very simple answer. Was this Joseph Smith, or was this Brigham Young that gave the quote? That's our question, and that is Mormon Mimsy for this week. If you want to play along, jump on Twitter and hashtag your guess, whether it's Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. And, of course, hashtag it Mormon Mimsy so we know where to look, or you can go on to Facebook there and comment in the episode show notes for this episode. All right, need to get to some listener mail real quick here. First, we got in an email from Scott, and it was in response to what Captain Fearnot was wearing during the assault of Captain Bogart's troops at Crooked River. This is his email. He says, quote, I think the officer's white coat was a trade blanket coat, popular and very warm from the 1700s to 1800s. These wraparound coats were made from the trade blankets produced to trade for furs. And then he sends a link here with a picture of what this mountain man white blanket looked like. And I have to say, this picture is quite fascinating, and the one thing that recurs in my mind is it's not very camouflaged. It's just a bright, white, very thick wool coat. I mean, it might have been camouflaged if everything around them is like freshly fallen snow, but I don't think it was at this time. That blanket must have just stood out like crazy, especially as first light was breaking and revealing the positions of the Mormons being so inferior to Bogart's troops. So, maybe it was just, that's the coat that Captain Patton had with him, and that he just decided to wear it to keep warm that morning, or, who knows? It's an extremely conspicuous coat. There will be a link for that in the show notes for the picture that Scott sent over, because it is quite fascinating to see this officer's white coat, this trade blanket coat. So, yeah, Scott, thank you for sending that in. Got in a secondary email here from Michael, and he originally wrote in to correct my assertion of chemical weapons being used in World War II in the Clean Cut Book of Mormon episode. I corrected it once, saying, I guess I was mistaken, because all his email said was that no chemical weapons were fired during World War II. And I was like, so it must have just been that they didn't fire it. And, I messed up my semantics. But no, Michael was very clear. He sent a second email clarifying that as far as we are aware, that there weren't chemical weapons actually used in World War II. World War I, definitely, and that's probably just where I was mistaken. I had thought that it was World War II as opposed to World War I, and apparently World War II, both sides were stockpiling chemical weapons in the case of a biological, windstorm that comes into town. So, of course, that's a sharp distinction that historians should never, ever make World War I versus World War II, and I completely messed that up. So, Michael, thank you for correcting me in the first place and for making the secondary correction and really enlightening me to the history behind this. His email was an essay. It's really impressive. Had another email in, and this was from Calypso. It says, I wonder if you may have gotten Joe and Mo mixed up. Googling the Muhammad dove ear brings up several references to the story you described. So this is interesting. That was the entirety of the email, and I had not heard of this before, so I went looking into this. Yeah, there is a story of Muhammad using the same kind of dove trick that Joseph was accredited with coming up with. When we read that in the 1843 article, I believe it was, I even found the newspaper article, a PDF of the newspaper on newspapers.org, and read it straight from that article, word for word. So, maybe the person that initially reported that conflated the Prophet Mo and the Prophet Joe, and they just still published it in their paper for it. Or maybe Joe did hear about Muhammad training a dove and he tried to do the same thing. Maybe the story, didn't actually happen. I'm not 100% sure. So there definitely is a much more abundant plethora of these dove ear incidents when discussing Muhammad. But when it came to Joe, it's much harder to find that story actually being ascribed to Joseph Smith. So any number of factors could play into this story, whether or not Joe actually did this and looked like a fool when the bird didn't fly down and peck the grain out of his ear. Who knows? I don't know if historians can come down one way or another and claim that actually did happen to Joseph or not. So, Calypso, thank you for sending that email in. The next email came in from Anonymous, actually. This was responding to when I talked about Mark Lichtenwalter having that weird podcast. He said, just listen to your latest episode. Dude, regarding Mark Lichtenwalter, that motherfucker is crazy. I lurk on a Facebook group called LDS Last Days and Prophecy Discussions that Lichtenwalter is the owner of. Holy period shit period. That guy is a Lafferty brother. Wow. If you know what I mean. I don't know if Mark has actually killed any of his family members, but who knows? Maybe. He says he's an extreme fundamentalist with 9 E's, as in I'm the one mighty and strong extreme. Bad shit is going to happen around this guy. Be careful. Anyhow, I'd appreciate if you didn't mention my name on the air on this one. I don't want to be blood atoned. Wow, that's some very interesting context on who this Mark Lichtenwalter person is. So, Anonymous, maybe this is a guy to keep an eye on. I've seen him posting up in some other Facebook groups that I'm part of as well. Maybe I should engage with this guy, see exactly what his take is. It might be interesting to have him on an episode of the podcast. If any of you know who Mark Lichtenwalter is, if you're at all familiar with him, let me hear from you. If you want to write in, send me a message. If you want to hear a discussion between Mark and I about the church, it might be interesting. Who knows if he'd even go for it, but, I'll throw that out there to the listeners. If you guys want that, let me know, and I'll see what I can do. But otherwise, maybe it's better to just disregard this Lichtenwalter guy and just forget about him, because he sounds, and from many of the Facebook posts that I've seen him posting in Mo 2.0 and stuff like that, he definitely does seem like there's a couple of screws loose. Or as Anonymous says it, that motherfucker is crazy. Okay, well, thank you, Anonymous, for sending that in. All right, that's all the listener mail we needed to get to for today. I wanted to ask you guys about something. And the reason why I bring this up is because everybody listening has reaped amazing benefits from the crowdsourced research that we've done in this show. I mean, people just sending in links or, talking about something that I messed up on in the history, especially people, writing in and, short essays, kind of like Michael and other people have done recently. It's really helpful to broaden the scope and, rely on other people's research just as much as my own. So the reason why I mentioned that is because I was in a discussion with a friend last week, and he told me of a story that it sounded familiar, but I wasn't sure if I could actually remember the details of the story. And the way that he related it is Joseph was talking to a couple of, I guess you'd call them learned men that were passing through Kirtland or Illinois or who knows at the time, because I don't know when the quote's from. And they were well educated in many languages, and Joseph was having a discussion with these guys, and he pulled out a German book and began to read German and put it back, and then pulled up a Spanish book and started reading in Spanish. And the people were just baffled because he was just spouting nonsense. He was just pretending to be able to read these things, claiming that he could do it, and it just baffled them. This is not the Greek Psalter incident where Joseph said, took this manuscript from one of the Bible manuscripts and said, I don't know what this is, but I know that there's not a dot of Greek on this paper, and that was actually a Greek scholar handing him a manuscript from the Bible that was written in Greek. So it's separate from that issue, from when Joseph did that, the Greek Psalter incident. This multiple languages incident of Joe's. It sounds familiar to me, but I just cannot pinpoint where I've heard it before, so I'm hoping that you guys will kind of help us out in trying to locate and ascertain this one story, because the level of help that has been offered by many people, listeners of the show, in locating specific stories has just been immense, and I've been relying on you guys a lot, so thank you very much for that. And, of course, if we are able to locate this, I look forward to relating the entire story to everybody on the next episode, but we'll have to go from there. The last thing I did want to mention before actually shutting it down for the evening, we just had our first NAMO home evening. Now, for those of you who are not Mormon and have never heard of family home evening before, it's just a kind of a Mormon thing where Monday nights you don't go out and do anything. You just stay with the family in the house and you do like family building lessons or scripture study or whatever. Oftentimes, family home evening for a lot of people just evolves into let's watch a movie and eat ice cream, which is great. It puts the family together in the home when they could be off, interacting with their friends or coworkers and whatnot. So it's a good system. So thanks to all of the listeners getting us to a Patreon goal, we started up NAMO Home Evening, and we just had it on the Monday previous to the release of this episode, and it was just so much fun. And of course, our featured guest for this first NAMO Home Evening was Marie from, my co-host of My Book of Mormon podcast. And of course, thank you to her for coming in. And thank you to the listeners who showed up. There were quite a few of you. I mean, I was surprised. I wasn't sure what to expect for a turnout level, but altogether, I think there were, maybe 10, 11 people that came in, people coming in and dropping out at various times. And it was, really fun to just interact face to face. And, I call this a digital veil for a reason. I mean, I'm staring at my computer screen and talking into a microphone. I don't interact much with the people that listen to the show, so that was just a great opportunity to take that and run with it. Now, if I'm not mistaken, when we were in the actual Google Hangout, I said that we're planning on just doing these quarterly, one every 2 or 3 months. But that just seems too confusing and not... If you're going to try something new, why just half-ass it, right? So we're going to do these monthly. We're going to try and set up monthly NAMO Home Evenings on the first Monday of every month, beginning at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Now, just to repeat, the first Monday of every month at 6 p.m. Standard Time, that is going to be our designated NAMO Home Evening block. Beginning at 6, and we'll just kind of go till whenever we're comfortable with calling it a night. We went a little bit beyond the 2-hour window we initially planned, and that's great. People had a lot to say, and it was fun to have those discussions. So for now, we're planning every single month. Be keeping an eye on the email address where you are signed up on Patreon.com. On those Mondays, you'll be receiving a link through the Patreon email server for the Google Hangout. You can just click on the link and jump in when we get started at 6 o'clock. So, and, of course, once again, thank you to all those who did show up. It was really fun to talk to you. Since this isn't a historical episode, we're not going to go over new patrons, but I do want to thank our Hall of Fame patrons, those who have been around for a long time or have contributed a lot, and those people who are, serve to be the backbone of this research effort. So those people are Preston, Jay, Chris and Christy, Tyler, Judy, Frank, Clara, and Tim, Randy, Mindy, Colette, Eric, Philip, Sean, Doug, Hal, Heather, and Brandon, and Karen. So those people constitute the vast majority of the financial support that has come through, and to those people and all of the patrons, thank you very, very much for that support and for making this investigative journalism instead of just a hobby. But that's everything for this week's episode. Of course, I need to shut her down by thanking a few people and calling it a night. First off, I need to thank Demonista for running the Facebook page. Also need to thank Julie, or The Real Emma Hale, for running the Twitter handle. Need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. For his music, go to aloststateofmind.com. Need to thank Greg Keeling for providing the artwork in the show. Go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog there. Legal counsel for the show is provided by the law offices of P. Andrew Torres. Be sure to check out Opening Arguments to hear his amazing legal wit. If you'd like to leave a voicemail discussing really anything that comes to mind, you can do so by dialing 864-NAKED-MO, 864-625-3366. It goes straight to voicemail. You can leave it there. I need to thank all the supporters of the show who support through patreon.com/nakedmormonism. It may be a coffee a month to you guys, but it's a lifestyle for me, so thank you very much. But most of all, I need to thank all of the fantabulous, amazing listeners out there for lending me your ear. Up to talk to you next time, here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.